did you do this?
Before Avengers Doomsday arrives, Marvel fans do not need another giant watch list. They need a clear explanation of how the MCU reached this point. Not every side character matters. Not every Disney Plus episode matters, and not every branch of the multiverse needs to be explained. What matters is how the sacred timeline broke, why the multiverse became unstable, and why Doctor Doom is now stepping into a universe already close to collapse. The story begins with Nathaniel Richards, a brilliant scientist from the 31st century who discovers that countless realities exist beyond his own. He meets alternate versions of himself and shares technology with them. At first, that creates cooperation. Then ambition takes over. Some variants decide that sharing power is not enough, and the result is the first multiversal war. One version of Nathaniel eventually finds a way to end that conflict. After destroying his variants and the realities that could create more of them, he becomes He Who Remains. He creates a single controlled timeline and establishes the TVA to prevent dangerous branches from forming. The MCU we followed from Iron Man through Avengers, Endgame exists inside the controlled structure that matters because the heroes were never moving through completely free history. Their timeline was being protected and corrected. Any event that created the wrong branch risked being erased by the TVA. That becomes important later when Doctor Strange looks into millions of possible futures during Infinity War and sees only one path to victory. Bruce Banner is transformed into Hulk during another attempt to recreate the Super Soldier program. Thor arrives from Asgard after Odin strips him of his power and forces him to understand humility. Loki grows up in Thor's shadow, learns that he is actually a frost giant, and eventually becomes the catalyst for the first Avengers team. That team exists because Loki's attack forces Nick Fury to activate the Avengers Initiative. Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Hulk, Black Widow, and Hawkeye begin as people who barely tolerate each other, but they become a team by surviving the Battle of New York. From there, the MCU moves toward Ultron, Sokovia, and finally Civil War. Civil War matters because it breaks the Avengers before Thanos ever arrives. Tony and Steve are pulled apart by politics, guilt, Bucky Barnes, and the revelation that Bucky killed Tony's parents while under Hydra control. Steve knows Bucky was being used as a weapon, but Tony reacts as a son who has just watched his parents die. By the end, the Avengers are no longer one functioning unit. Doctor Strange enters from a completely different direction. He begins as an arrogant surgeon, loses control of his hands, and discovers magic through Kamartaj. The Ancient One teaches him that sorcerers draw power from other dimensions and realities. Strange eventually becomes one of the most important protectors of the Time Stone, placing him directly in the path of Thanos. Infinity War is where all these stories collapse into one event. Thanos collects the Infinity Stones and wipes out half of all life. Strange sees millions of possible futures, but only one path appears survivable. If the sacred timeline and TVA were still controlling dangerous branches, then many apparent victories may never have been real victories at all. The idea changes the way Endgame looks. 5 years after the snap, the surviving Avengers discover time travel through the quantum realm. Tony develops the technology that allows them to move through time safely, and the team launches the time heist to collect the Infinity Stones from the past. Then Loki escapes. That one mistake becomes one of the most important events in the multiverse saga. The Loki who escapes in 2012 becomes a variant and is arrested by the TVA through Mobius and Sylvie. He discovers that TVA employees were taken from real timelines and that He Who Remains created the organization to protect his preferred reality. Sylvie eventually kills He Who Remains, and the controlled timeline begins branching uncontrollably. Loki then gains the ability to move through time and eventually becomes the being holding the multiverse together. Instead of one machine controlling the branches, Loki physically sustains them himself. The sacred timeline becomes something closer to a multiversal tree, with countless realities now existing at once. That is the true consequence of Endgame. The Avengers defeated Thanos, but the time heist indirectly helped free the multiverse. Steve Rogers creates another complication when he returns the Infinity Stones and chooses not to come back immediately. To leave, he stays in the past with Peggy and lives the life he was denied. That decision creates another reality and makes Steve's future more complicated than the simple ending we saw in Endgame. Then Spider-Man: No Way Home makes the multiverse problem worse. Peter Parker asks Strange to make the world forget his identity. The spell collapses, and characters from other realities begin entering the MCU. Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man cross into the main universe along with their villains. Even after Strange repairs the damage, the walls between realities are clearly no longer stable. Multiverse of Madness escalates that danger. Wanda moves through alternate realities while Strange confronts versions of himself and the consequences of multiversal interference. By the end, Clea arrives and tells Strange that he has caused an incursion and that they need to fix it. That moment may become one of the most important setups for Doomsday. Thunderbolts creates a second Avengers-style team. Valentina's experiments lead to Robert Reynolds becoming Sentry, while Yelena, Bucky, Red Guardian, Ghost, US Agent, and the others are eventually presented to the world as a new Avengers lineup. Finally, Fantastic Four First Steps brings us to one of the most important realities in the entire story. Reed Richards, Sue Storm, Johnny Storm, and Ben Grimm exist in a separate retrofuturistic universe. Their son Franklin Richards may be one of the most powerful beings in the multiverse, and Doctor Doom's interest in him could become one of the central reasons these worlds collide. That is where Avengers: Doomsday begins to take shape. The multiverse has been freed. Incursions are increasing. The TVA no longer controls reality the way it once did. Loki is holding the branches together. Strange has already been linked to incursions. The X-Men universe is exposed. The Fantastic Four have their own reality. And Doctor Doom is entering a system that is already unstable. So before Doomsday, the most important thing to understand is not every Marvel detail. It is the chain reaction. Endgame broke time open. Loki freed the multiverse. No Way Home damaged the walls between realities. Multiverse of Madness accelerated incursions. The Marvels connected the MCU to the X-Men. Fantastic Four brings Doom and Franklin Richards into the equation. And now all of those threads are moving toward the same event. Avengers: Doomsday is not starting a new crisis. It is the result of everything that already went wrong.